Hi, I'm Karie Bible here for Film Masters, and I'm talking today to the great Sara Karloff. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm not the great one, my father was.
Well, you're doing so much to keep his legacy alive, and so many of us are very grateful for that.
Well, the fans do that. The fans keep his legacy alive. They're just wonderful. They really are.
You. It changed my life. I first saw the Universal horror films as a little girl around the time of my birthday on Halloween. And it just fired my imagination, made me fall in love with movies. I wound up going to film school. I'm the tour guide at Hollywood Forever. Like everything traces back to those films. And I know a lot of people who feel that way.
Well, I've met a lot of fans that say similar things. That's true.
I have so many questions for you. The first one I'm sure you get asked a lot is when you realized your dad was an icon. Because for those of us whose parents did normal things, that's got to be a strange thing to dawn on you. Oh my God, my dad is like one of the greats in film history. Like, how did you first come to know that?
My father was he was the antithesis of the roles he played. And he was so modest, so soft spoken, and so well educated, and so articulate, and so kind. And he just couldn't have been more different than the roles he played. He never brought his work home, thank goodness. Um, that he was not a movie, he did not lead the life of a movie star. His interests were not Hollywood esque. Um, he loved gardening, he loved reading, he loved animals. He was passionate about the English game of cricket since he was British. Um, so that living with my father was not living a Hollywood life. Um, I was not aware that he was a Hollywood quote unquote star. He did not bring that home with him, nor did he live that kind of life. So I was 19 before I saw Frankenstein, and I saw it on television alone in our living room. And by that time, of course, I'd heard so much about it that I watched it rather studiously and wasn't at all frightened. Didn't didn't really say, "Oh my goodness, that's my father." I just watched the film from a totally different perspective than a daughter, and totally different perspective than a fan. I watched it as the film that I'd heard so much about. And so I watched all his films from a different perspective, I'm sure, than a fan would, but nonetheless, I was never aware of his stardom because he didn't lead that kind of a life. He didn't regard himself as a star. He was very humble, very modest. He had a lovely sense of humor, and it was often self-effacing, turned back on himself, and he just wasn't what one would expect either from a horror star or from um, a movie star. And so he just was a lovely English gentleman and lovely human being.
It's really beautiful to know that because I think a lot of times there is kind of a disconnect between the image on screen versus the real person behind that
Oh,
image.
there always is a disconnect. There always is. They're playing a role.
Did you ever go visit him on the set?
Not of his iconic films. I wasn't born when Frankenstein was made. I was born when he was doing Son of Frankenstein. And really most of the fans are boys, not girls. You're the exception. And so I I was just out of sync with his iconic films. And then I went to private girls' school, and that was not the sort of film that girls went to. And so there are a lot of my father's films I haven't seen or didn't see when they were in the theaters. I've seen them now that I've seen a lot of them, but certainly not all of them. He made 167 films. But I've seen a lot of them now that they're released in different format. But I can't explain how different he was from any of the roles he played and how different a life he led. And I think a lot of that had to do with, well, with several things. Think it had to do with his British upbringing, and the fact he was the youngest of 9 children by 7 years, and that he was trained, educated for the diplomatic corps service, consular service in Britain. So all those things formed his inner self and his personality. And he was the black sheep of the family going off to become an actor. But his inner young years of schooling, formal education, and family upbringing were certainly not those of someone thought to become a movie star, let alone a horror icon.
I heard that Kevin Brownlow is one of my heroes, and when you did the Universal horror documentary, I seem to recall you telling a story about him meeting Lon Chaney, which I love that story. Can you
It's a wonderful story.
tell us that story again?
Well, Lon Chaney, of course, started the whole horror film, if you like. My father preferred the word terror, but and he was the big cheese on the lot, Lon Chaney Sr. And and my father was nothing but an extra on the lot at that time. And so my father, Lon Chaney was driving a car, and my father was taking the bus. And one rainy night, when the day was over for both of them, certainly on doing different things and different quality of things, my father was standing at the bus stop in the rain, and Lon Chaney offered him a ride home. And I mean, that's number one offering, number 147 on the lot, a ride home, which says a lot for Lon Chaney Sr. And my father, of course, said yes. And I'm sure he was a bit stunned and very great. I know he was very grateful for the ride to get out of the rain. And so my father took the opportunity to ask Lon Chaney, what can one do as an up and coming hopeful actor? What can one do to find a way from being an extra to being noticed and successful in this business? So Chaney evidently said something to the effect, find something nobody else is doing, nobody else wants to do, and then do it better than anybody else. And so several years later, along came Frankenstein, which of course would have been offered to Chaney Sr. had he not unfortunately died at a young age. And then it would have it was offered to Bela Lugosi, and he turned it down because it was a non-speaking role and because of all the makeup. And then just fortuitously, my father was in the commissary at the same time James Whale, the director, was in the commissary, and he invited my father over to his table for coffee. And he had noticed some work my father had done in the criminal code. And that he had a small but showy part in that film, first in the play and then in the film. And so he asked my father if he would audition for it. And my father at that point would have auditioned for dog catcher. So he did, and he spent 2 weeks with Jack Pierce in the makeup department, who was head of the makeup department. My father always referred to him as an absolute genius. And Jack had studied for what he thought a created monster or human would look like. And so together they came up with this brilliant makeup, thanks to Jack's talents. And they did a screen test, and my father was cast as the role. The film had already begun to shoot without anybody having been cast in that role yet. And so my father was late getting to the film because no one had been cast yet, and that's a little known fact. But Chaney gave my father some invaluable advice and a welcomed ride home that night.
I also greatly admire how you and Bela Lugosi Jr. and the Chaney family all really work together to do events, to be in documentaries, to protect your parents' image.
Well, that's because we're invited to do so, and that's because of the fans. So it all goes back to the fans. You know, if it weren't for the fans, I'd be home cleaning my own oven. I mean, it's thanks to the fans. I don't call up people and ask to be interviewed. I'm invited to do interviews, and that's due to the fans. It is all due to the fans for all of us. And the minute we lose sight of that, we should stay home.
And also, I've also been told the story that, Boris wasn't even invited to the premiere, which is just
That's right.
completely crazy to me. That is
That's because he was not anticipated to become the star of the film. Colin Clive, of course, was anticipated and expected to become the star of the film. And my father didn't, I mean, in the opening credits, rolling credits, there was a question mark, not a name. In the ending rolling credits, my father's name was up opposite the creature or the monster. But he just wasn't supposed to become an overnight star after 20 years in the business. I mean, it was my father's 81st film. And as he said, no one saw the first 80.
I think that's another reason he was probably so humble. He struggled for so long, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. Like, I've gotten to see one of his silent films, and I don't think a lot of people know that it took a long time for that overnight success.
It certainly did. It took 10 years in British Columbia in repertory theater, sometimes getting paid, sometimes not. And then 10 years in Hollywood before anybody knew he was there. He was an extra first, and then a supporting role, and then finally he got his break. But he'd been there making films when nobody knew he was there making films. And so he was eternally grateful for the pivotal difference that role made, both in his life, personally and professionally. I mean, it was, so he would say, tongue in cheek, that the monster was his best friend, you know.
And I love how instrumental Mr. Karloff was in founding the Screen Actors Guild.
I think part of that was because of the treatment extras and supporting actors were receiving at that time. My father, who was already a starving actor for 10 years or 20 years, really, had received, he was already starving and very thin. And he lost 25 pounds while making Frankenstein. So you can imagine the lack of sleep, the lack of food, the long, long hours at the hands of the studios and the directors. And this was not unusual back then. So he felt very passionate about the formation of what was a union to protect actors coming up who didn't have a vehicle by which they could express their needs or their issues or their complaints. And those 15 founding members were putting their careers on the line, and they were running the risk of never working again by forming SAG. And my father, not only his card number was number 9, and not only was he a founding member, then he remained on the board well into the 1940s. He was very, very silently proud of being a part of that, very pleased with the work it achieved. And I don't know how he feel about it now, but he was very pleased about it.
What is your favorite of your father's films?
I have favorites for different reasons. I love the Grinch. I love the Grinch. I'm wearing my Grinch sweatshirt this morning. But I think Targets is my favorite film, Peter Bogdanovich's film. It's my father playing himself, essentially, an older horror film star who is questioning whether or not he's reached time to get out of the business. But really, it expresses my father's real feeling that the real terror is on the street, not up on the screen. And that's how my father felt. He felt that we had become a very violent society, and the violence exceeded that which was on the screen.
Sadly, that is still true today.
It's as that film is as appropriate today as the day it was filmed, and it was pulled prematurely from the theaters because it was released at the time of the Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy assassinations. So I think it's a fine film. He enjoyed working with Peter Bogdanovich. He admired his creativity and his talent. It was Peter's first effort in those areas of filmmaking, and the film stands on its own 2 legs today, just as much as it did then.
I agree. How did your father like working with Roger Corman? Film Masters, that has asked me to do this interview, they are releasing his Roger Corman film, The Terror, from 1963 on a DVD with lots of extras. How did he like working on that film and with Roger Corman in general?
My father never brought his work home. He never talked about other actors or directors. He did say one time when he had made one of Corman's films, he said that he came home and he said to my stepmother, he said, "There's a young man on this film that's really going to go places." And that was Jack Nicholson, who was also in The Terror.
In the name of the government of France, I order you to open this door.
Your pardon, young sir. I was at my devotions. I did not hear you.
I'm sorry, sir, but surely I made enough noise to awaken the dead.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Tell me the story. I've heard you say this before about the Grinch, because you said he didn't bring his work home, but he had called you and told you to watch.
It's the only time my father ever brought his work home. He didn't bring it home, but he called me and he said, I've done something that if you and the boys," and I have 2 sons, they were very young then. He said, "I think you and the boys might enjoy. It's going to air tonight on television, and you might like to see it. I think it's pretty good." Pretty good. Yeah. He won a Grammy for it. And it was wonderful, of course. And it's part of his legacy. I just learned last year from Craig Carlson, who is Chuck Jones's grandson. And I'm privileged to know him and Linda Jones, who is Chuck Jones' daughter, that my father did that in one take. One take. He did, and he was the voice of the Grinch, and he narrated it. And those lyrics are very tricky, and to change voices and characters back and forth, and he did it in one take.
That is one well-deserved Grammy.
You bet. Well, the Grammy goes to the performance and to the work itself. And of course, the Grinch is magical in and of itself. So it's well deserved. Now, my father was in England when the Grammys were awarded, and my father's agent went in his place to receive the Grammy. And so the next time my father came over from England to Los Angeles to work, he went to his agent to talk about some more work. And his agent said, "Here, Boris, here's your Grammy. Here it is, see?" And my father took it from him, and he looked at it, and he said, "Looks like a bloody doorstop." And he took it and he put it over at his agent's door and left it there. My father was not into awards. And so eventually it made its rounds back to me, and it's on my living room bookshelf. But he was devoted to his profession. He felt so lucky to be able to work as much and as long as he did, but he didn't do it for the pretties.
Makes sense. Did he ever say how I know he didn't bring his work home, but how do you think he felt about typecasting? Because I know there's some of the horror stars like Bela and Peter Lorre who really hated the typecasting. And then it seems like Boris and Vincent Price kind of leaned into it and really didn't mind it.
Well, I've heard interviews that my father has done, and that's one of the questions he was usually asked. And he said, "No, I don't mind it. I'm very lucky." He said, "Anybody is lucky, no matter what their profession is, if they are known for being good at what they do, no matter what it is." He said, "I'm very lucky. If any actor really is typecast, if you're a youngster playing certain types of roles, if you're a romantic lead playing certain types of roles, any actor really is typecast if he thinks about it. I'm very lucky. It's paid the bills, and but actually," he said, "I've done 5 plays on Broadway. I played in the Lark opposite Julie Harris, which is one of the most memorable experiences of my life. I've done 20 some albums for children. I've done a huge body of radio work of all types and sizes. I've had 3 television series of my own. I've been fortunate enough to be a guest on many television programs. So I've had a pretty broad-based career, not just as a boogeyman."
I agree. I think people don't realize how diverse he has been.
That's right.
You know, I would love to. I wished I could have seen him on Broadway in Arsenic and Old Lace and
Yes.
Capital. Oh, that would have been
Yes.
amazing.
Yes, and he was in Peter Pan, which he loved because he said the kids loved to come backstage and try on his hook and fly across the stage. And I was fortunate enough to visit him when he was in Peter Pan, and he just loved kids and loved doing the children's albums. Excuse me. And he loved working with children, and he loved having an audience of children. So when I was back watching Peter Pan, he arranged for me to see it from the wings and backstage and out front and everything. And at the end of my visit, he said, "Well, I can tell you don't have the fire in the belly to become an actress because you paid more attention to Nana the dog than you did to me," which is right.
It's not for
I mean,
everybody. I think you're either born with it or you aren't.
I think so.
Do your sons, how do they feel about his movies, his legacy? Are they at all in the business?
They're not in the business, but they're very proud of him. Very proud.
I love it when the families really are proud and take that legacy to heart and do so much to keep it going.
Well, I think any member of any icon who isn't proud to some measure is not telling the truth, because you have to be proud of the achievements of a family member that are sustained by the admiration of the public. And my father was so grateful and so gracious to his fans and so appreciative. He answered every letter. He signed every picture. He really truly appreciated his fans.
It really is amazing that how these films have held up. This past October, the LA Opera had an orchestra and they played live the score for Bride of Frankenstein with the film at the Ace Theater, which I was there for. And it was sold out. And so this film came out in 1935, and in 2023, it is selling out.
Yes.
It's just incredible for something to have that rich and long of a life.
It is. I mean, I'm just absolutely overwhelmed by the multi-generational appeal of my father and his films, and the diversity of his work, that, as you said, is not as well known as it should be or could be. But he's known. I've at some of the conventions I'm invited to, people bring up their grandchildren to meet me, and their grandchildren know the lines of some of the films. I mean, it's just goes through families, and it's so rewarding when people come up to meet me and talk with me. They just tell me stories that go back in their families and share stories with me. It's been such a learning experience for me and so rewarding that I can't imagine not having had this experience that the fans have given me.
I'm very proud to be one of them.
Oh, thank you.
I have to ask you, during lockdown, when I met you at Midsummer Scream, I think a year ago, I mentioned I started this little YouTube project called Hollywood Kitchen, where I make the recipe attributed to a classic star. And I've had David J. Skull on several times to talk about.
Yeah.
He's wonderful. And you confirmed for me that Boris did put sherry in his guacamole.
Well, so I'm told.
So I'm told. Okay. Because I've made that several times, which is great, by the way. And that was the one thing I was like, sherry and guacamole? But you said
it would be good. It would be good.
Did he eat a lot of English food? I love kind of looking at stars through their food, because I think it's another way to kind of humanize them and see them as real people and not just, screen stars.
They are real people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They absolutely are. So
he loves sand dabs.
Pardon?
He loves sand dabs.
What are sand dabs?
Sand dabs are a type of fish.
Okay.
Okay, it's a white fish, thin white fish. He, but he didn't. He liked flank steak. But he ate. I mean, he traveled all over the world, so he ate of whatever was put in front of him. He was not a fussy eater, but he was a healthy eater.
Well, I have a 1930s cookbook here, favorite recipes of the famous movie stars. And in this, there's a whole biography, a photo of Boris, and a recipe for Parisian potatoes.
Really?
Always reminds me of the line in The Old Dark House, will you have a potato? So
Well,
yeah.
maybe that's how that got there. Who knows? I've never seen that. That's one I've never seen that book.
Oh wow, I should scan it and send you a
Oh, I'd love to see that.
Did he ever cook in the kitchen, or did he just like to eat?
Well, there's a fairly well-known photograph of him cooking in our kitchen in Beverly Hills with an apron on, and I also know he volunteered at the USO.
That's fantastic.
Okay, but he retained his British subjectship. He never became an American citizen, and so he the last 10 years of his life he was back in England. He went back to England to live, and so he enjoyed English beer. He enjoyed gin. He enjoyed English food. Not many people do. But he wasn't a bland eater. He just wasn't a finicky eater.
I've heard he liked to garden. I heard this quote that he liked to garden in his wickes. What are wickes?
There's a picture of him. Well, wickes are shorts that come just to the knees. And they're sort of like Bermuda shorts, but they are an English term. It's an English term. And they're not underwear, but you don't usually wear them out and about. They may be a cricket term, but I'm not sure. But I also have a picture of him in a top hat, no shirt, and in his wickes, watering in the garden.
That is awesome. That is such a beautiful thought and
mental picture. Yes, image. But he loved to garden. He really did love his garden. And no, he did not bury his friends in the rose garden. But he loved to garden, and he loved to play tennis. He was passionate about the English game of cricket. To go to a 3-day cricket match in England he thought he died and gone to heaven. He was a member of the Hollywood cricket team. He played with Sir Aubrey Smith, who was an English character actor. A lot of British actors belong to the English, the Hollywood cricket team. And let's see, he loved animals. At one time, my parents had 22 dogs in Beverly Hills.
That is living.
Yeah, they lived on 3 acres, and they had Bedlington Terriers, which look like lambs. They brought the first Bedlington over from England in the 30s to the West Coast. I have a Bedlington now. They had Scotties and West Highland Terriers. And at one time they had 22. I'm sure that's because they must have had a litter of puppies and They didn't keep 22 dogs all the time. My father had a pig named Violet. He had some turkeys. He loved the outdoors, but he was a voracious reader. He was on the $64,000 question program on children's fairy tales. That was the category. He was very, very knowledgeable about literature. He edited and wrote forwards and for books, and he was a very, very well educated, articulate man, very well read. And I think that's why he and Val Lewton got along so well. He really enjoyed doing the 3 films that he did with Val Lewton. They got along beautifully because Val Lewton was a very articulate, well-read, educated man.
I love Val Lewton films too. Those are just a treasure. He was able to do so much with such tiny.
Yes. The Body Snatcher was just magnificent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't like when classic stars are always pitted against each other. Like a lot of people, there's always these Chaplin versus Keaton debates or Joan Crawford versus Bette Davis. And I know sometimes Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi get sucked in.
Yeah.
But I don't think they had a problem with each other. In fact, I mean, I've always heard they got along really well. They were both very professional, and that any feud was probably manufactured, really.
It was a hook to get the audience in to see their films. But my father was often asked that question in interviews, and he said it that Bela was Hungarian and had his own personal interests, and my father was British and had his own personal interests. So quite naturally, offset, when they weren't working together, they didn't socialize together because they had their own independent interests. But he said Bela was a beautifully trained and experienced actor before he ever came to America, and that he was a very fine actor. And the only thing that Bela might have done better was to master the English language better, because it was the language in which he earned his bread and butter. But he respected him and felt he was a very fine actor.
Good.
And if you think about it, actors today, once they finish a film, if they're not cast together again in a film, they won't necessarily see each other again. Hollywood, unless they go to some gala or some charity, and not all actors do that. So if they're not working together, they don't necessarily socialize together.
It sounds like he kept his personal life very separate from his whole career, as you've mentioned.
He did.
That's probably a great way to stay sane. To do that.
It is. I mean, he had a lot of friends in the business, but he had just as many friends who weren't in the business at all.
Well, Christmas is coming up. Do you have any, besides maybe watching The Grinch, do you have any Christmas traditions that you had with him growing up or that you share with your sons?
The Grinch mainly. The Grinch mainly. I have a son who lives here in California, and he's married and has a daughter, and she's married, and we spent Thanksgiving together. And then I have family in Colorado, where I have a granddaughter who's married and expecting her first child, and I have a grandson who is finishing his fellowship in glaucoma, and he is doing that in Indianapolis. But he and his wife and 2 young sons are coming out from Indianapolis to Colorado, where his sister lives, and his mother. And so I'm going there for Christmas this year. It'll be a Colorado, hopefully a white Christmas for me in Colorado with that part of my family.
Well, that's wonderful. I love that you're a grandmother, and congratulations.
I'm a great grandmother.
Great grandmother. Congratulations on that. That's tremendous.
Yeah, it is. It's fun. It's fun. And I just got back not too long ago from England. And I got to see, I'm very good friends with the man who wrote the definitive biography on my father, Stephen Jacobs. And loads of friends that I have there, Dave Swift and Stephen Jacobs. And then I visited a college friend of mine in Northern Ireland, Julie Mackey, and they live on Mahee Island in Northern Ireland. And so it was a wonderful trip. And then I came home, and I every year for the last 25 or almost 30 years, I've done a show in New Jersey, it's now in Parsippany, New Jersey, called Chiller Theater. It's a big show. There's at least one of everything there, and from Russian wrestlers to scream queens, and in between. And so I did that, and then I spoke at Columbia University, and then I went to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and then I went to Connecticut, and then I came home. So getting ready for Christmas and Thanksgiving is a bit of a challenge, but I'm glad to be home.
Sara, thank you so much. This has really been delightful, and it's just been wonderful to talk with you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been my pleasure. And Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Healthy New Year.
Happy New Year and Merry Christmas.
And Merry Grinchmas.
Merry Grinchmas.
Thank you. Same
Thank
to you.
So much.